Darius Carter stepped into the gleaming lobby of Pendleton and Gray Publishing with a mixture of pride and trepidation. His leather notebook was tucked under his arm like a talisman, its frayed edges bearing witness to late nights of scrawling verses by street lamp glow. He'd secured an appointment to share his first poetry manuscript, a collection woven from subway rumbles, corner store confidences, and the whispered prayers of weary commuters. The receptionist directed him to a glass-walled conference room where three editors sat behind a long oak table, their pens poised over blank notepads. He watched them leaf through his pages, their expressions polite but distant. He told himself he was prepared for criticism, that he knew the industry prized a certain polished cadence, but nothing had readied him for the polite smirks and exchanged glances that rippled through the room. One editor murmured about thematic cohesion, another about market viability. When Darius looked up, he met sympathetic nods. Then the confession. His work was too urban, they said, the slang too raw for their refined catalog. His poems, they explained gently, belonged to the underground, not to their prestige imprint. Darius felt his chest tighten. He had known of publishing's gatekeepers, their aversion to verses that sounded like cracked concrete and creekside jazz rhythms. But to hear it spoken aloud was a blow sharper than any rejection letter. He'd poured his uncle's sermons, his mother's lined hands, and the hiss of late-night trains into those stanzas, believing that truth demanded its own platform. Yet here, in this polished room, his truth was dismissed as novelty. He rose from his chair, each step toward the door echoing like a challenge. He clutched the manuscript to his chest as the lead editor offered a perfunctory apology and a thin smile. "Keep writing," they said, as though a single phrase of encouragement could erase the sting of being told his voice didn't belong. Outside, the traffic hurtled past, taxi horns and train whistles harmonizing in a song no boardroom could mute. Later that evening, Darius rode the subway home, the rumble beneath his feet thrumming in solidarity. He closed his eyes and heard the rumble transform into the heartbeat of the city, unyielding, unapologetic. Every station stop, every fare dodge scam, every whispered phone call was poetry in motion. In that underground cathedral, he vowed his words would no longer wait for permission. He would bring his verses to the platform lights, to the corridors where commerce met confession, until every echoing tunnel forced the world to listen. And as the train roared past flashing graffiti and drab concrete walls, Darius Carter gripped his notebook tighter, ready to stomp every prejudice into dust with the power of his truth. Night fell like a velvet curtain as Darius lugged his second-hand speaker and mic stand onto the crowded subway platform. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting pulsing shadows across commuters hunched over their phones or earbuds. He found an empty corner near the stairwell, where the walls converged in a natural amphitheater beneath the rumble of incoming trains. Unpacking his gear, he could feel the eyes of hurried strangers flicking toward him, curious, wary, indifferent. He pressed play on his phone and watched the beat drop, a jittery sample of rattling rails and distant horns, then lifted the mic to his lips. His first verse cut through the station's hum, words bristling with the tension of narrow stairwells and silent glances. He spoke of backpacks weighed down by overdue fees, of the exhaled prayers of shift workers tipped out onto rain-slick platforms, of the graffiti tag that marked a city's pulse as much as any train schedule. Each line struck the tile walls and ricocheted back, mixing with the hiss of the arriving train. A few startled heads turned as Darius's cadence built. His second verse tumbled faster now, painting the commuter's commute as a ritual of resilience. The old woman who counted steps to stave off vertigo, the teen clutching headphones to mask a lonely lullaby of longing, the suited man whose swollen briefcase held more debts than documents. The crowd grew still, phones lowered, as his raw narrative unfurled in rapid stanzas. When the chorus hit, "This track's our lifeline, don't let your truth derail," the energy shifted. A group of teenagers hopped off a train just long enough to snap photos. An elderly man cupped his ear, nodding. A mother lifted her toddler to see the performer whose words felt like home. As Darius roared the final refrain, the train departed with a thunderous roar, and in its wake, the station fell beautifully silent. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then applause erupted, claps echoing down the tunnel, whistles shrill as train horns. Darius lifted his mic in salute and scanned the faces, some bright with surprise, some misted with tears, all alive with recognition. He realized in that moment that the subway, once a space for overlooked journeys, had become a stage for unapologetic truth. And as he packed away his speaker, Darius Carter knew he had found the platform he'd been denied, a pulpit where his poetry could stomp out every doubt and make the city itself stand still to listen. Within hours of that midnight performance, videos of Darius's subway set had exploded across social media. A commuter's shaky footage, his microphone glinting under the fluorescent lights, his voice unraveling the city's untold stories, surfaced on Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram, tagged with number sign Stomp the Racism. Within the first day, clips had millions of views. Viewers marveled at how his words cut through the station's din to expose the injustices hidden beneath urban noise. Local influencers praised him for reclaiming public space, and strangers posted comments like, "He speaks my life," and finally, "Poetry that won't be locked in an ivory tower." News crews descended on the station during rush hour. Reporters framed the tiled columns as backdrops to Darius's verses, interviewing commuters who confessed they'd slowed their steps just to catch a few bars. One elderly woman spoke of feeling known for the first time in decades of daily rides. A young student wiped tears as she recalled line after line that echoed her own struggle to belong. The video reached far beyond city limits. National outlets ran segments headlined, "Subway Poet Shakes Up Publishing World," and late-night talk shows clipped highlights, marveling that a single impromptu performance could ignite a conversation about race, class, and the power of raw truth. Back in the boardrooms of Pendleton and Gray Publishing, the very editors who had once chuckled over Darius's too urban slang gathered in urgent huddles. Screens on every desk looped the runaway clips, and their polite smirks had vanished, replaced by panic. Marketing directors fretted over lost opportunities. The chief editor, voice shaking, drafted a desperate outreach, an apology, an invitation to renegotiate, a plea for grace. Rumors flew of rival houses ready to swoop in and sign Darius to multi-book deals. They called in contract lawyers, publicists, and junior editors, anyone who could patch a deal before the moment slipped through their fingers. Meanwhile, Darius received messages that felt surreal. Emails from indie presses begging for permission to publish his manuscript, a feature request from a nationwide poetry festival, and a direct message from a well-known late-night host asking if he'd perform on television. Through it all, he remembered the sting of that conference room snicker and felt a surge of vindication, proof that his voice, born in subway tunnels, demanded to be heard on every stage. And as the city's pulse quickened with anticipation for his next appearance, Darius Carter realized he had stomped more than rhythms into the platform floor. He had stomped away publishing's narrow definitions and opened the door for every poet whose truth refused to stay silent. When Darius stepped into the marble-floored lobby of Pendleton and Gray, using the back entrance, no longer as a supplicant, but as the subway's unexpected sensation, he found the receptionist waiting with a guarded smile. Moments later, he was led into the same glass-walled conference room, where he'd felt the sting of dismissal. But this time, the long oak table was sparse, just one editor and a publicist, their posture tight with nerves. The editor rose first, clearing his throat. "Mr. Carter, I want to apologize for how we handled your manuscript," he began, voice measured. "Your subway performance. It changed everything. We'd like to discuss publishing your collection, stomp lines, and we want to hear your terms." He slid a contract across the table, the ink still wet in places, the royalty rates glowing on the page. Darius picked up the document, flipping through clauses that now included a co-marketing clause, acknowledging his subway roots, a guaranteed first printing of 25,000 copies, and a promise to feature his voice in their upcoming diversity initiative. The publicist chimed in, voice eager. "We've secured appearances on national book tours and late-night shows. We know you didn't need us, but we can amplify your reach." For a moment, Darius felt the thrill of victory. the boardroom's cool gloss finally bending to his will. But then his eyes drifted to the fine print, editorial oversight, to ensure brand consistency, and option on all future works, wording that smelled too much like control. The editor, sensing his hesitation, leaned forward. "We trust your vision, but we need to protect our investment. Let's find a compromise." Darius closed the contract with a gentle thud. He recalled every subway sniffle that punctuated his rhymes, every echoing footstep that added weight to his truth. "I appreciate the offer," he said quietly, "but my work wasn't born in polished rooms or marketing plans. It came from platforms where no one handed me a microphone. If I sign, I need full creative control and the right to perform my poems anywhere, subways, libraries, or TV, without fear of breach." The editor's jaw tightened. The publicist exchanged a glance. For 10 seconds, the air hummed with unspoken calculations. Then the editor nodded slowly. "Full creative control," he echoed. "No performance restrictions. And we'll revise the option clause to a standard first right of refusal." He tapped the contract again. "That work for you?" Darius felt the city's pulse beneath his feet even here, felt the rumble of trains and hearts. He smiled, extended his hand, and said, "Let's make some noise." As they shook on the deal, the glass walls of Pendleton and Gray no longer felt like barriers, but like windows into a world that had learned to listen. And in that moment, Darius Carter knew that his poetry would never again be confined to dusty shelves or silent rejection. It was free to stomp across every stage it chose, unapologetically. Darius woke before dawn on the day stomp lines officially hit shelves, his heart racing as he slipped on a crisp new t-shirt stamped with the book's cover art. He carried a stack of signed copies and caught the first morning train to the busiest downtown terminal. No velvet rope, no gala fanfare, just fluorescent lights and the steady rush of commuters. He set up a folding table next to the ticket kiosks, arranged his books in neat rows, and clicked on a small speaker playing a low pulse of subway rumble beneath his own recorded verses. The first customer was a bleary-eyed barista clutching a travel mug. She paused mid-order, peering at the book's cover, a silhouette mid-stomp against a grid of subway tiles. "Is this the subway poet?" she asked, voice hushed. Darius nodded and signed the inside flap with a flourish, the silver pen glinting in her surprised smile. Word spread faster than any formal announcement. Soon a line formed down the platform stairs. Office workers, street artists, student poets, all waiting to purchase a copy and exchange a few words about how his lines had rattled their mornings. As the sun climbed, Darius ambled across intersecting lines of foot traffic, pausing at each entrance to read stanzas that captured the station's rhythms. At one entrance, he performed a brisk 10-minute set, layering new verses about the city's hidden graffiti cathedrals and the poetry scrawled on platform columns. Crowds gathered, phones recorded, and the echo of applause lingered even as trains roared past. By midday, stomp lines had sold out at the station newsstand, the vendor waving to Darius with triumphant thumbs up as he restocked from boxes in a nearby storeroom. In the afternoon, Darius moved on to an art opening at a converted warehouse gallery. There, printmakers had translated his poems into linocut posters displayed on stark white walls. He signed each print as well as his book, talking late-night tunnels with curious art students who asked about his process, his midnight courage, and how the stoic platform lights had become his most honest audience. A curator approached him with an invitation to collaborate on a public art installation, verses etched into bronze plates embedded in sidewalks near transit hubs. By evening, Darius found himself back on the tracks, this time beneath the grand vaulted ceiling of Central Station's main hall. He shared the stage with other train line poets he'd met online, an immigrant storyteller whose monologue traced her father's journey by freight car roof, a spoken word duo whose harmonized refrains turned station announcements into song. Together, they turned the concourse into a cathedral of voices, pulling travelers out of their routines and into a collective celebration of art born from rails and stones. When the final train departed at midnight, Darius packed away his gear to a scattering of cheers and friendly goodnights. In the hush that followed, he reflected on the day's whirlwind, signed books in hurried hands, stanzas reborn in frozen smartphones, and the steady thrum of trains nodding approval. His debut collection had not only found its way into print, but had rewired the city's heart, reminding everyone that poetry needn't wait for permission to stand center stage. And as the station's lights dimmed one by one, Darius walked away knowing that every line he wrote would carry the echo of those platforms, and the unwavering belief that true verse belongs wherever truth can be heard. Dawn broke over the crisscrossing tracks of Central Station as Darius carried a stack of freshly printed copies of Stomp Lines to the newsstand run by the same vendor who had cheered him on at his very first subway performance. The air still hummed with early morning commuter chatter as he arranged the books beside the newspapers and magazines, their covers catching the flickering station light. A sign scrawled in marker announced, "Stomp Lines, a subway poet's debut." And by the time the first train rolled in, a small line had formed. Baristas clutching coffee, delivery drivers in neon vests, hurried students pressing textbooks to their chests. He greeted each buyer with a nod and a flourish of his silver pen in the dedication line, noticing how hands passed the book along to friends, who in turn snapped photos of the page before cradling their own copies. Underneath one of the arched windows, a makeshift stage had been cleared. Darius set down his battered PA and invited fellow poets he'd met online, an elder Caribbean storyteller with a voice like warm rum, a punk rapper whose hooks crackled like subway sparks, to join him in an impromptu reading. As he launched into a new verse about the neon glow of night trains and the secret prayers whispered by spray-painted pillars, the rumble of wheels became a living drum, the crowd's cheers blending with the station's own rhythm. By midday, the newsstand had sold out its entire stock of Stomp Lines. The vendor motioned to a storeroom, where Darius found two more cases, each one snapped up by eager hands, before he'd even returned to the stage. A local arts collective approached him with flyers for an upcoming Poetry on the Rails showcase, a guerrilla reading tour that would pop up at transit hubs across the region. Darius agreed on the spot, mapping out a route that would take him from the elevated platforms of East Side to the subterranean tunnels downtown. That afternoon, he slipped into a corner of the city's largest open mic night, held in a converted freight car parked beside a decommissioned rail yard. He watched as his poems were read back by strangers, tinged with their own accents and timbres, and felt the swelling pride of seeing his words breathe in new voices. A university literature professor, clutching a copy of Stomp Lines, cornered him afterwards with a request. Would Darius guest lecture in her contemporary poetry seminar so her students could study how urban experience reshaped the canon? He accepted, later standing before eager undergraduates who presented papers on everything from his use of onomatopoeia to his reclamation of public space as poetic canvas. By evening, Darius returned to the station where it had all begun. A small crowd of regular commuters greeted him like an old friend, asking for signed posters and flash mob invitations. He climbed onto the same dusty ledge where he'd first tested his mic, clicked on his speaker, and delivered a final blistering verse that sent shivers through the fluorescent tunnel. As the applause rippled through the crowd, Darius Carter knew that Stomp Lines had done more than fill newsstands. It had inked itself into the rails, a permanent testament to a city that finally stopped to listen. By the time the last commuter train squealed through Central Station that night, Darius stood alone atop his makeshift stage, the worn speaker at his feet playing the echo of his final lines. The crowd had thinned to a handful of diehards, students in hoodies, a couple clutching their dog's leash, and the vendor who sold him coffee on that first morning. Above them, the vaulted ceiling caught every syllable like a cathedral of stone, and Darius felt the weight of every verse he'd ever written. He closed his notebook with a soft snap and spoke without the mic, voice rich with gratitude. He thanked the strangers who became family, the city that had adopted his voice, and the industry that had finally recognized truth on its own terms. Then, he invited anyone who had been touched by his words to step forward and share a line of their own. A young woman with paint-splattered jeans hesitated, then recited a couplet about the courier who delivered life-changing letters. A security guard lowered his cap and shared a reflection on the loneliness of night shifts, his voice steady but brimming with feeling. Over the next hour, one by one, listeners delivered stanzas born from bus stop benches, tile-flooded platforms, and the dark underbellies of trains. Each was met with applause and nods of deep respect. When the impromptu open mic slowed, Darius lifted his hand to quiet them. He spoke of the day he'd first been told his poetry was too urban, and how that rejection had propelled him into tunnels and onto platforms until his words refused to be silenced. Tonight, he said, we proved that a single voice can become a chorus, that every story waiting underground deserves to be heard above ground. As the final applause faded, station lights dimmed in unison, signaling the end of service. Commuters gathered their belongings, but before they departed, each approached Darius to shake his hand, to hold his gaze, to say, "Thank you." He watched them merge into the night, some hurrying for last trains, others lingering under the glow of the tiled arches, knowing his poetry would live on in their echoes. Walking home through empty turnstiles, Darius carried his notebook close to his chest. He heard the distant rumble of a train pulling away, a lullaby of iron and steam that had become the soundtrack of his journey. In the hush, he understood that Stomp Lines was more than a book or a performance. It was a movement etched into the rails, a testament that when a voice dares to rise, it can shift the very ground beneath us. And as he stepped into the cool night air, the city's heartbeat pulsed in his veins, proof that poetry's power lies not in where it's published, but in the lives it moves.